Well, hello everybody. This is Dennis Marburger here in the broadcast studios of John and Kathy Irvine for our second edition of Curmudgeonly Conversations. Our first conversation was with Mark Kreslins. Tonight, we'll be speaking with the great Scott Horton, our favorite foreign policy expert. And Scott was gracious enough to join us tonight from Austin, Texas. Scott, how are you?
I'm doing great, Dennis. How are you this evening?
Doing very well, thanks. Doing very well.
Good to see you.
Well, likewise, my friend. And we're very appreciative of your time. You just did that Scott Horton week on the Tom Woods show. You've had a whole series of wonderful interviews, including one that I think we'll be discussing tonight that you did with Pat Buchanan. And we're very fortunate that you're going to be with us and explaining some of these things with us. And a lot of different topics we can talk about. But tonight we're going to focus on the new Cold War. And as you and Pat had discussed, how that developed, where it's going, and what it means for the future.
Absolutely.
Okay, so again, in the interview, and as we know from studying the history of this thing, it looked like, we were finally getting the end of the evil empire, and then that did occur, probably in about as fortunate a circumstances we could have hoped for. And then Bill Clinton and company, and his predecessor and his successor, perhaps, did they snatch defeat from the jaws of victory from the standpoint of the American people and a hope-for peace dividend?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, if you think about that movie Terminator 2, back when it came out, and it was still the same thing, was the computer set off a war between America and Russia. Right. But the kid says to the Terminator, Russia? But I thought we were friends with them, right? Because the original Terminator came out, the USSR was still there. Right, so by the time Terminator 2 came out, he goes, but I thought we were friends. Like, does anybody even remember that? I thought we were friends? The USSR is gone. The Soviet Union is gone. The red flag, get this, on Christmas Day, 1991, the red flag came down from over the Kremlin and the red, white, and blue Russian flag went up. And as Pat Buchanan put it in that interview the other day, where the rubber really meets the road, where the tank treads meet the road. The Red Army up and left Eastern Europe. The occupation was over. It was over. And to even back then the John Birchers who said, don't trust him, it's all a ruse. Pat Buchanan goes, no, man, I'm telling you, the Red Army no longer exists. We won. The Russian army is this tiny little pro-capitalist Russian nationalist thing, and it's back behind the Ural Mountains where it belongs, where no one can complain. So, and as you put it, fortunate circumstances, hey, from 1988 through 1991, when the Cold War ended, the wall came down, the people of the Eastern Bloc were liberated, and then finally the Soviet Union itself dissolved. It was absolutely a miracle. That whole thing about Christmas Day was just the icing on the cake. I mean, you had, 20 nations set free all at once with hardly any bloodshed at all. In Romania, they put the Reds up against the wall and shot them. And a couple of places, almost everywhere. It was, I think in Czechoslovakia, it was called the Velvet Revolution, but really it was the whole thing was the Velvet Revolution. And I like this too, that the left-wingers were the stodgy old right-wing conservatives holding on to the Communist Party. And the youth, the radicals in the street were the right. They were the pro-capitalists, right?
Yeah.
They weren't conservatives. They were radicals, but they were radicals for freedom and for capitalism and for tearing down the conservative old communist dictatorship, which is a great set of ironies for us all, right?
Well, it sure is. Yeah, if you're going to be conservative, well, what are you conserving? And in that case, the conservatives were conserving evil, and the radicals were radicals for freedom, as you say.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, and remember back at that time, it was all blue jeans and Michael Jackson and McDonald's and Americanism, even if you want our most crass consumerism, came and knocked the culture of the Soviet Union over. It just overtook it. There's no way that they could keep up with the example that America was setting for the world. And we destroyed them without a shot being fired, essentially, which is just unbelievable to think of. Going back on the way that all played out from the time of the refugees starting to break through the fences without getting shot into Austria, and then finally the wall coming down in '88, and and the rest of that as it played out. So at the time now, George H.W. Bush, Reagan's successor, he actually, it was funny, he tried to preserve the Soviet Union. He was afraid what would happen if right-wing nationalists took over Ukraine. So he was hoping that even though he wanted the Warsaw Pact nations to be free, he wanted the Soviet republics, the Baltic states, Belarus, and Ukraine to stay, and actually tried to prevent the final collapse of the USSR, if you could believe it. But in exchange for getting the Soviet troops out of Germany, what he did was he promised Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO will not move 1 inch to the east. And not only did George W. Bush promise that, but his Secretary of State, James Baker, promised that. And then as well did the Prime Minister of Great Britain, who I think it was still Thatcher. I forget if it was John Major by then. And as well as the President of Germany, of West Germany. They said, look, you pull your troops out of Germany. You allow reunification of Germany under American dominance, under Western dominance. And we promise we will not expand our NATO military alliance 1 inch to the east. And in fact, that's all at the National Security Archive now. It's finally been declassified. They said it wasn't in writing. It was too in writing. You can read it right now.
That's great, too, because you do hear that objection from people occasionally.
That's right.
But you're bringing us the scoop here, that it is available in writing, so that nobody can make that claim now that it wasn't in writing. Right. And it's not a myth, it's fact.
That's right. And that's at, I think, the George Washington University School of Law, the National Security Archive. Did I have that right? Which founding father is that named after? I forget. Anyway, it's the, or maybe it's the Georgetown University? Anyway, the point is, National Security Archive, you can find it online. And then they, in the Clinton years, they broke it. And what it was, of course, was, and as Pat Buchanan complained, Pat Buchanan, the entire paleo-conservative movement, said we should not be doing this. This is unsportsmanlike behavior here, dancing on their grave and pushing, our victory into their face in this way. And as Pat mentioned in that interview, and by the way, the transcript is on antiwar.com today. Right. If people want to look at that, it's under Pat's name on antiwar.com. But George Kennan, who was the guy who wrote the essay for Foreign Affairs in 1947, or was it 48, called On the Sources of Soviet Conduct, and it was written by X, anonymously, but it was George Kennan. I guess everybody knew it was George Kennan at the time. And what he said was, we have to contain Soviet communism and prevent its spread. And now, of course, that policy was elaborated on to a great degree, but he was the one who originally coined that doctrine. So he was the grayest of State Department, Council on Foreign Relations graybeards. And he said in the 1980s that Bill Clinton was ruining everything. And he wasn't just against it, he was screaming hell no at the top of his lungs. He tried to stop it. And in fact, Bill Clinton's Secretary of Defense, William Perry, tried to stop him from doing it. The State Department under, I guess at that time it was Warren Christopher, and then later Madeleine Albright pushed for it. But Perry even, I'm trying to remember if he resigned over it or what, but there was a big fight. And all of the Soviet experts, all of the best Soviet hawks from the Congress as well, like Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar, and all of these guys tried to stop it too. And Bill Clinton pushed it through essentially for political purposes because of the Lockheed money and the Polish votes in Illinois to make sure that he would get reelected in 1996. He made a bunch of promises to the Polish community in Illinois that will bring Poland into NATO. And then that was just the beginning of it. Now, part of the idea was, and it depends on who you ask, part of the idea was, no, we're going to bring Russia into NATO. And this was every New World Order conspiracy theorist's worst nightmare come true, right? That thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Now America's going to combine with Russia and we'll have one army of the North under the United Nations going to fight against our common enemies in especially Islamic South Asia, right? And so Strobe Talbott, who was Bill Clinton's national security advisor and primary architect of this policy, said, listen, we'll make it clear to the Russians that they're welcome. And they created the NATO-Russia Council. And they said, so there's no reason for the Russians to feel like we are expanding the military alliance at their expense, or that we're trying to hem them in or continue to contain them, because those days are over. We're friends now. It's fine. But, of course, that didn't last. And it didn't last because Bill Clinton especially went to war against Serbia twice. And especially in 1999, that was the end of that. And at the end of 1999, of course, famously, Yeltsin resigned, Yeltsin the pushover, who had objected all along to NATO expansion. He resigned and appointed his Prime Minister, Vladimir Putin, to replace him, which, of course, gave Putin a huge leg up on the upcoming election that was just 2 or 3 months away at the time. And he's been essentially the president ever since then, even though, of course, he did step down to be prime minister for a little while, as per the Constitution there, which he didn't just declare himself president for life. It's something. There is still a constitutional law there for what it's worth. And the thing about Putin is, as Justin Raimondo wrote, there's an article he wrote at antiwar.com back in probably 2004 or something, and it's called Putin the Patriot. And the point, and Justin Raimondo was always the type to, go ahead and upset you with the headline. You're supposed to just react and say, oh no, I'm conditioned to hate this man. But the thing is, you're not a Russian. If you were a Russian, you'd be thankful that you had essentially a strong conservative Republican president protecting your country from foreign threats. They wanted a drunk pushover, and Vladimir Putin essentially said no. And he kicked out all of the oligarchs who were essentially robbing the country blind. Now, he empowered a bunch of oligarchs, his own oligarchs, of course. It's not like the guy's a hero. Just from their point of view, in relative terms, he was, compared to Boris Yeltsin, his predecessor. And so, go ahead.
Scott, so this is great information. It occurs to me I was remiss in not giving you a proper introduction. Some people are probably watching this and saying, man, this guy knows a lot. Where did I learn about all this? And antiwar.com, what's that? So it's a great website, antiwar.com. You are the editorial director? Is that correct? Of antiwar.com, right. Which is essential reading in the morning, afternoon, and night for anybody that wants to understand what's going on around the world and all these things. You are also the director of the Libertarian Institute, which is another great resource with all sorts of information and interviews and articles. And speaking of interviews, you just recently concluded or had the 5,000th interview on the Scott Horton Show, which is the #1 leading podcast and radio program regarding foreign policy. And you get all sorts of guests. I think the most popular one is Gareth Porter. The most frequent one has been Gareth Porter. You just interviewed him again. I haven't listened yet, but I saw you just yesterday, I guess, interviewed him or something. And if you want to know, folks, what's going on with Iran and the alleged Iranian nuclear weapons program, read what Gareth Porter has written, read what Scott's written, and listen to the discussions between Scott and Gareth. So you go to antiwar.com, it's a treasure trove of information, and when you hear that reference, that's what Scott's referring to.
Yeah. And by the way, I guess I could elaborate a little bit. I know this is like the Republican Liberty Caucus here, that the founders of antiwar.com are Republicans, Eric Garris and Justin Raimondo. Well, Justin just died a couple of weeks ago, but right. Eric Garris is still a registered Republican, and essentially we are capitalist libertarians. Ron Paul, you can see on my hat, right. We are Ron Paul, essentially, I guess we vary on exactly how libertarian we get, right. But we're certainly, constitutionalists compared to imperialists anyway. And so this is essentially, it's a right-wing American critique of imperialism. I mean, when you mentioned at the beginning here, that this was sort of spurred by the conversation with Pat Buchanan on the show the other day. And Pat Buchanan, for young people who aren't familiar, I don't know, but for anyone who's older who knows at all about Pat Buchanan, he was a speechwriter for Nixon and a speechwriter for Ronald Reagan. And the guy, probably wears red, white, and blue pajamas to bed at night. He is a Catholic and a conservative and a Republican, his whole life long. And at the end of the Cold War, Pat and, Phil Nicolaides and Scott McConnell and Jude Wanniski and this whole group of guys broke away from the Republican Party on foreign policy. And Pat wrote a book called Republic, Not Empire, right? He didn't say future commie utopia, not empire. He said republic, not empire. In the name of James Madison, we have to stop this before we destroy what we're trying to conserve here in the first place, which is the American constitutional system.
Right. And
right. If we,
yeah. Well, I was just going to say yes, and of course you're here with Ron Paul. We're recording this. It'll make it available to everybody eventually, but we'll be showing it at the Oakland Macomb Campaign for Liberty meeting. And so, we're with Norm Singleton and all the gang, and Daniel McAdams and all that. So, yeah, but it's a great point that you're making about this critique. If people hear anti-war and they mistakenly think it's a left-wing approach, it actually isn't. And in many ways, the impetus to war, the war machine, has pushed a lot of things in our society that many people who call themselves conservatives would not like, as Robert Higgs and others have written about. So
first of all, the bankruptcy.
Yeah,
I mean, the national debt is $22 trillion. And we pay nearly $500 billion. The national government pays nearly $500 billion of our tax dollars every year just in interest on the debt. I mean, this is insane. To any conservative, you have to tear down the national security state if you want to have a republic at all. That is your choice. You cannot have it both ways. You want a constitutional government. The national security state that was built up in the name of the Soviet Union must be torn down. They just passed another $750 billion appropriation, and that doesn't count for the VA cost, doesn't count for the interest on the debt, doesn't count for the care and feeding of the nuclear weapons in the energy department, or any of these other things. You add it all up, it's $1 trillion a year. No exaggeration. And you find, left-wingers, right-wingers, straight up ideological less accountants and libertarians. You mentioned Robert Higgs at the Independent Institute have all agreed on this number. $1 trillion a year we're spending in the 21st century on the terror wars and associated militarism. And see, this really goes to the heart of what NATO expansion is about. Is in 1991, right, or 1992, right after Iraq War I, Dick Cheney, who was then the Secretary of Defense, who's a right-wing nationalist, had a group of neoconservatives working for him. Scooter Libby, Zalmay Khalilzad, and Paul Wolfowitz. And these men, all three, played a role in lying us into war 10 years later, 12 years later. Okay? But at that time, working for Dick Cheney, they wrote up a policy paper for the Pentagon called the Defense Planning Guidance of 1992. And what it said was, now that the Soviet Union is no longer in our way, we will dominate the entire world militarily from now unto infinity. America will never allow any quote unquote near peer competitor to militarize enough to even think about challenging us. And we will not let even any potential combination of regional powers amount to the ability to challenge our dominance. So that means if China and Russia heal their split, or if Bush and Obama and Trump heal it for them, and they, build their alliance back up again, that we will go to war with them before we let them get to anything like parity with us. And not that anybody is trying to challenge us, but just the idea is, from their point of view, that, if you want to be generous about it, that the whole world will go to chaos if America is not the dominant force in the world. Why? What if it were the Russians or the Chinese were the dominant force in the world? Don't you think it would be worse? So therefore it has to be us instead. When in fact the Russians and the Chinese don't have the motive or the ability to dominate the world the way America does at all. It's all really very self-serving. But their idea is, they call it leadership. As Madeleine Albright said, we stand taller and see farther into the future. Right? This is the lady who gave speeches justifying strangling and blockading and bombing Iraqis from bases in Saudi Arabia, the exact activity that got our towers knocked down 3 years later. And then she has the nerve, 1 year later, she has the nerve to say that we see further into the future. When she is the principal architect of blowback against the United States in the worst way, bragging on TV that we think the price is worth it to sanction and starve Iraqi babies from bases in Saudi Arabia in order to force the people to rise up and overthrow Saddam, something which they had no power to do whatsoever, and everybody knew it, including her. And this is why Al-Qaeda attacked us on September 11th, first and foremost. So it's just wrong that the Americans stand taller and see farther and are more moral or any of these things. It's just not true. And why should it be? Think for a moment. Does it really make sense? And I know I'm from here too. I'm a Texan, so I'm extra from here, more than some nut from Kansas or something. I'm a real patriot. But does it make any sense that the middle part of North America should dominate the old world from now on? It makes no sense, because the whole world burnt down in World War II except the USA, and the USA had such an economic and military leg up on the rest of the planet after World War II. That means that we have to keep it this way at all costs from now on? No. And go ahead.
Okay, sorry. So as you're saying this, it makes me wonder, and I think some of the people we've referenced earlier have written about this sort of thing. Was it an idea to for America to dominate these foreign countries, or was the idea this was a way for Madeleine Albright and Dick Cheney and the people at the Project for a New American Century and the rest of them to dominate all of us here in America?
Right. Yeah, all of the above, absolutely.
Or some combination, But
absolutely.
That was the excuse.
And look at the blowback in Russia here. So forget the terror war and back to Russia and the Cold War for a moment. So here is George Kennan in 1998 talking to Thomas Friedman at the New York Times and being asked by Thomas Friedman, what do you think about NATO expansion? Kennan says, I think the Russians, first of all, this is 1998, so 21 years ago. He says, I think this is the beginning of a new Cold War, our NATO expansion against them. I think this is the beginning of a new Cold War, said Mr. Kennan. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies. I think it is a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. This expansion would make the founding fathers of this country turn over in their graves. We have signed up to protect a whole series of countries, even though we have neither the resources nor the intention to do so in any serious way. NATO expansion was simply a light-hearted action by a Senate that has no real interest in foreign affairs. He continued, this is all worthwhile. What bothers me is how superficial and ill-informed the whole Senate debate was, added Kennan. I was particularly bothered by the references to Russia as a country dying to attack Western Europe. Don't people understand? Our differences in the Cold War were with the Soviet communist regime. And now we are turning our backs on the very people who mounted the greatest bloodless revolution in history to remove that Soviet regime. Pretty severe words. Now it gets even better. He says, and Russia's democracy is as far advanced, if not farther, as any of the countries that we've just signed up to defend from Russia. It shows so little understanding of Russian history and Soviet history. In other words, he's saying the regime we have there now is better than we could have ever dreamt of. And you're going to rub their face in our victory in a way that's going to hurt them and discredit them, which is, of course, what happened, right? Yeltsin discredited and in favor of right-wing nationalists like Putin. He says, it shows so little understanding of Russian history and Soviet history. Of course, there is going to be a bad reaction from Russia. And then the NATO expanders will say that we always told you that's just how the Russians are. But that is just wrong. So what does he say? He says, this is before. This is in 98, as they're really just getting it going, as they're adding Poland and the Baltic states. He's saying what's going to happen is the Russians are going to react. And then all the people who are now telling us, don't worry, the Russians won't react, are going to tell us, aha, see, the Russians are bad. And what they're doing isn't a reaction, it's an action. And now we have to react to that. And we have to defend the West from them. And you know what? The epitome of this is Hillary Clinton in the campaign in 2016 complained the Russians are moving their troops around right on NATO's doorstep. Well, what was she talking about? She was talking about Vladimir Putin, if the authority even went that high on this, that some troops were moving between bases inside Russia. And she's saying, oh, it's right on NATO's doorstep. But that's because her husband, and she was in the Senate when George Bush did it and supported it when she was in the Senate when George Bush did it. And then she was the Secretary of State when Obama did it. She's culpable in all of this the whole time. And then she goes, oh my God, look, the Russians are moving troops from one base to another inside Russia. This is a threat to us. The same lady who then helped to perpetrate the entire Russia hoax on the American people for the last 3 years, which this is an interview that's not published yet, but you're going to really like it. It's with David Stockman, who's a former Reaganite, a great libertarian, great capitalist, great American patriot, hardcore anti-imperialist and anti-Cold War with Russia, and has been good on Russia for many years. And he has some great articles debunking Russiagate, and me and him went through that the other day, just completely destroying and debunking Russiagate. But let me add too here that Bush continued to expand, as I just mentioned. Bush continued to add states, including threatening to bring former Soviet Georgia into NATO. Which, think about that. Is anybody familiar with a map of an old world? Georgia is in the southern Caucasus Mountains, which is in between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Does that sound like the North Atlantic to you? The North Atlantic Treaty Organization that's for protecting our closest friends, the British and the French, from the USSR? Now we're doing what again? And this has continued into Trump. Even Trump has brought in Montenegro and Macedonia and added. And Tucker Carlson interviewed President Trump and said, but that means that if Montenegro gets in a fight, that we're treaty bound to defend them. But that doesn't make any sense. Like, why would we do that? And Trump goes, I know, isn't it crazy? Yeah, but you're the guy that just did it and could have stopped it. But he's so detached, he doesn't know. He's too busy watching what TV's saying about him to be paying attention to even what he is himself doing in expanding this.
Right. And Scott, it's an interesting point that and you bring up the Russiagate hoax, which is really FBI gate and Hillary gate and all these other
CIA gate, John Brennan gate, high treason gate is what it is.
And Mueller gate and all these things and Comey and all that. Well, during the campaign, President Trump said things that were very reasonable and actually quite good about Russia. And he said, well, why do we have to have this problem with Russia? And why can't we have better relations? And all that made a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. And he was attacked for it, and it appears that so there were people that thought that they could, politically powerful people that were threatened by that, because that might mean maybe we'd have lower defense expenditures, and so this whole thing you talked about earlier, all the money going out, that sounds to me like that's the real swamp right there. Right. And so the swamp
and in all their brains, it's all a self-licking ice cream cone too. We're just like Kennan says here. As soon as the Russians start reacting, then the Americans are going to say, see, we told you how evil they are. And so this is in that David Stockman piece that we ran on antiwar.com and that I interviewed him about, where they have all these quotes now from, these aren't senators. These are the FBI counterintelligence agencies, Strzok and Page, the boyfriend and girlfriend. They're texting back and forth and saying, oh my God, the stuff he's saying about Russia and how we should get along with them. Well, we just know the Russians are our enemies, and what could possibly be possessing him to say these things? Maybe he really has been suborned by this foreign power, because no reasonable human being would say that, even though he'd been saying it all along and won the Republican Party nomination based on it. So apparently the grown adult voting population of at least the right half of the United States thought that was fine and gave him the nomination over Jeb Bush and over Marco Rubio and over Ted Cruz and all of these hawks. It's precisely because, so this wasn't just, geez, we intercepted an email that reveals that Trump plans on being nice with Russia. This was his foreign policy, as you just said. Repeatedly in the campaign, he ran on getting along with Russia. So these people weren't just framing up Trump. They were nullifying the American people's foreign policy. In the debate, Hillary Clinton goes, I want a no-fly zone so that we can protect al-Qaeda in Syria from Russian planes. And Donald Trump goes, did you hear that? She wants a no-fly zone over Syria to protect al-Qaeda from Russian planes. I rest my case. He wasn't accusing her of anything except saying, did you hear that? right? I don't want to get in a war with Russia. Vote Trump. And lo and behold, the American people chose him. Now, I saw there's this great reporter, Molly something. I don't want to get it wrong. Hemingway, I think, who's kind of a right-wing reporter. I forget who all she writes for, but she's been really good on Russiagate all this time. I might be confusing her name. I'm sorry. But she was on the Tucker Carlson show, and she was just laying this stuff out so well. And Tucker Carlson says to her, he goes, oh, no, I guess she put it this way to him. She goes, yeah, essentially what we have here is some bureaucrats deciding that they want to overturn the results of an election and the American people's foreign policy that they just voted to ratify. This conservative retrenchment from Bush and Obama expansion years, which is what the American people voted for. And Tucker goes, oh, my God, that's right. It's bureaucrats. Not just overturning the election, but overturning the foreign policy that they so disagreed with. And I say, yes, that's perfect, except one thing. These aren't bureaucrats. This is the secret police. This is the American Gestapo. This is the FBI Counterintelligence Division and the CIA. And they went and infiltrated all these spies into the Trump campaign basically to try to set these people up, to say Russia emails until Carter Page or George Papadopoulos would repeat it back. And then they go, aha, Russian emails, predicate. And they open up a counterintelligence investigation and then a criminal investigation into the nominee for the major party candidacy of the presidency of the United States. And even before he was the official nominee, for months he was the presumed nominee. Everyone knew that John Kasich and Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz could not stop Donald Trump. If Jeb Bush couldn't stop him, he was the nominee, period. And they were pushing this stuff from the end of 2015. The FBI Counterintelligence Division was infiltrating spies into the campaign to try to incriminate these people, to echo back some talking points about Russia that they could use to seize on and wage this attempted coup d'etat. And they tried to prevent him from being elected by smearing him all summer long as a Russian agent based on this stuff. Then after he won the election, and this part's unbelievable. It sounds like I'm the one who's crazy, but I beg your audience to check the New York Times because this is legit. This is in there. They wanted to get Mike Morrell, the acting head of the CIA, Obama's head of the CIA, to brief the Electoral College and to tell the Electoral College that the Russians stole the election from Hillary and that they should give it to her. And that if they won't do that, then they should at least make it a draw and then throw it to the House of Representatives so that the House of Representatives could elect Paul Ryan or Colin Powell. I mean, are you kidding me? And then when the guy's sworn in, 3 days before he's sworn in, they leaked this completely bogus intelligence report saying that they have all this reason to believe that he's been compromised and all this stuff, even though it's full of all these caveats and excuses. And it's, as Brennan admitted, his hand-picked analysts who looked at it. It was a government assessment, not any kind of CIA assessment or National Intelligence Council assessment. It's completely hollow. You go read it. It's only 3 pages long or something. It's a complete joke. It even says in there, just because we make an assertion does not mean that we're saying that we believe it is true. I mean, it says that in there. The thing's completely preposterous. But then they talked about how they even contemplated sending Rosenstein in there to wear a wire and to try to entrap Trump so that they could, use Rex Tillerson and the cabinet to invoke the 25th Amendment to remove him from office. The 25th Amendment, which is there in case the next Woodrow Wilson has a stroke and his wife tries to take over the government, right, which is what happened then, or in case there's a nuclear strike on Washington, D.C., so that we know that the Secretary of Interior is 10th in line if he's out in, another state at the time of the nuking or whatever. That's what the 25th Amendment is for. It doesn't say anything about if the CIA and the FBI feel like canceling an election because they disagree with the guy's foreign policy, then you can go ahead and get the CEO of Exxon to overthrow the president, for God's sake. And if they had really tried that, there would have been a war. If they had tried that, there would have been right-wingers with rifles, and I'm not saying I'm on the side of this or whatever, but I'm saying the very most right-wing reactionary people in this country would have started murdering Democrats and who knows who. I mean, the idea that these people were able to convince themselves that they were going to somehow prevent, I mean, in fact, I left out one. They were talking about figuring out a way to screw him out of the nomination itself at the convention. They were going to try to figure out a way to give it to Kasich or give it to somebody else, but then they figured out that the room would have torn them limb from limb. There was no way in the world that they were going to be able to do it, but they were talking about it up until the day of the convention. How can we stop this guy? Maybe we can stop this guy. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about republic or empire. Okay, that's not a constitutional republic where the FBI and the CIA launch an attempted coup against the president. Okay, that is a corrupt, evil empire that does that. And now that the Soviets are out of our way, it's us.
Right. Well, Scott, you've been very kind to share all this knowledge with us, and I think we've gone over time here, but
Sure, sorry.
No, it's great. This is fascinating, actually, and folks, I mean, you're not going to find another resource like Scott that's got this information that can rattle us off like that and give us the whole historical background and perspective and context. This is very important, and I think it's worth noting that again, that there are apparently elements within the United States government, and they have their sponsors, but that they want a tense situation with Russia. And if we stand down and have peaceful relations with Russia, which is what President Trump had advocated as a candidate, but it was a great point that he'd made, and it was politically popular. In fact, there were studies that showed that the reason he carried the states he needed to carry for this election, including here in Michigan, were that there were areas where there were higher than average casualties in these ongoing wars, and the people in those areas who had been voting increasingly Democratic in presidential elections had a big shift back to the Republican side. And they saw Hillary as the deceitful hawk that she is, and they voted for Donald Trump on that basis. But it was very important. Right. Russia's a nuclear-armed superpower, and we have all sorts of people that we could bring up also that have discussed how this whole thing about Russiagate was a hoax, and why it's so dangerous that they're baiting Russia. Putin's a Russian Orthodox guy fighting Muslim terrorists, and you think we could find some sort of way to work together on that. And that's it's very sad that this thing has happened. But I want to thank you, Scott, once again, folks. You listen to Scott.
Hey, can I say a couple things real quick?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'll try to be real quick. I just want to mention here real quick. First of all, on what you were just saying about we can not just have free, friendly relations with Russia. We could completely demilitarize. And that's not some naive, weird, silly hippie thing. Okay? The United States of America does not need to have a world empire at all. We could, as Ron Paul said, defend this country with a couple of good submarines. Nobody's ever going to mess with us in the world. In fact, there was not long ago an appropriations hearing in the Senate where this was, I think, in the Obama years, where one of these highest Army generals said to the senator, listen, okay, it was during the fight over the sequester. Remember that? The sequester. And the general goes, listen, Senator, we have all the strength we need to defend the United States, no problem, okay? But if you want us to be able to go off at a moment's notice and intervene anywhere in the world to whatever degree you can imagine, we're going to need some more money. We're going to need to have a whole different structure for our military. Defending America, that's a piece of cake. There are no threats here. When they talk about a possible war with Russia or China, they're always talking about in Eastern Europe or in the Pacific. Never here. No one even pretends to believe that these countries threaten us. You know, what's wrong with Putin, the Orthodox Christian who we ought to be able to work with against joint problems, especially, say, for example, Islamist terrorists in Afghanistan or something like that? Well, the answer is because his country is big enough to be independent from us. They don't threaten us. They don't support our enemies. They don't do anything to us, but they're big and strong enough to continue to tell us no and to not have to do whatever we say. And so that's the thing of it. It doesn't have to be this way at all is the real point there, and then real quick. Oh, go ahead.
Caitlin Johnstone, I think she just wrote that's really the issue here is that Russia can be independent and these people don't like that. Plus that they can make a whole lot more money, have a lot more power over us in many ways if they gin up this threat.
That's right. Hey, there's no coincidence that it was an executive vice president from Lockheed named Bruce Jackson who founded the Committee for NATO Expansion to lobby to bring all these countries in. He also created the Committee for the Liberation of Iraq back in 2001 and 2. No coincidence there either. Then the other important history here is the Bush years color-coded revolutions. Everybody remembers marching the 3rd Infantry Division into Iraq, right? But what got less attention was the Rose Revolution in Georgia, where they overthrew Shevardnadze, who had been the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, who had helped destroy it, had helped Gorbachev to destroy the Soviet Union, was one of the greatest, heroes in all history, and then had become the president of Georgia. And America overthrew him in favor of Mikhail Saakashvili. Then they overthrew Milosevic with another one, color-coded revolution in Serbia. Then they did the same thing in Ukraine in 2004. And then in 2005, Tajikistan, they tried in Lebanon, but that didn't work because the Christians and the Shiites have a huge coalition there that prevented that, but they tried it. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting 2 or 3 of these, but they were all United States NED, that is National Endowment for Democracy, and USAID and George Soros and other non-governmental organization type groups financed all of these. They would give them, they were the Rose Revolution. In Tajikistan, it was the lemon or the pink revolution. They had yellow and pink flags there. And there's always a gimmick like that. In Ukraine in 2004, it was the Orange Revolution. And it's always to overthrow. It's always to falsely contest a democratic election that doesn't turn out the way America wants. Democracy doesn't mean you have regular elections and the voters choose. Democracy means you install a government that's compliant with the USA. And if not, then America, the template is America will finance the losers of the election to refuse to accept it, like Hillary Clinton, and just stay in the street. They call that the pussy hat revolution, I guess, right? Stay in the street. That's right. And demand that, insist that it was stolen and work on a coup. And then the real worst part of this was they did the same thing again in Ukraine in 2014. And it wasn't exactly an election, but it was a fight over a trade dispute and whatever. And America used very right-wing, as in the proud grandsons of the Galatian SS, of, Hitler-loving Nazis, to do that coup d'etat and take over that country. These are the same people that George H.W. Bush tried to hold the Soviet Union together because he was afraid of right-wing reactionary nationalists in Ukraine picking a fight with Russia. That was one of the reasons he wanted the Russians to stay dominant in Ukraine to prevent that, and gave that famous speech. Yeah, that's right, Victoria Nuland, Robert Kagan's wife. And they engineered this coup. And so this is, and I'll leave you with this, is that in Ukraine that led to the seizure of Crimea, which was fine because it belonged to Russia anyway, and not one shot was fired. No one was killed. No one was killed when Russia seized Crimea. And they had a referendum that was like 85% or more in favor of joining the Russian Federation, which was no surprise. Essentially the entire population, less the Tatars there, wanted to join the Russians. This is a super duper majority, 80-90% around there. But then there were pro-Russian and ethnic Russian forces in eastern Ukraine who didn't want to accept the new coup d'etat junta and declared independence. And the Kiev regime immediately attacked them. And there was a terrible war that raged through 2014 and 15 and some of 16. And there's a peace deal now that's holding it together that was pushed by Germany and France over Obama's dead body, over his, lame duck body at the end of his presidency. And they went and pushed through this peace deal. So the peace is holding there. But those Russians, those terrible, scary Russians who are just, Vladimir Putin, the evil dictator who's trying to reconquer all of Eastern Europe. Well, when Eastern Ukraine begged to join the Russian Federation, he said, "Yet. No, I won't. I will send," and he wouldn't send any army divisions in there to help them either. He sent in special operations forces, deniable forces essentially, to help them resist. But he absolutely refused to integrate them into the Russian Federation and cut his defense budget at the same time, just to reinforce the point. He's not trying to steal Ukraine. He's just trying to keep it out of NATO. And that was why America was in there messing around. The Americans were threatening to kick them out of their only warm water naval port in the world there at Crimea, Sevastopol, Crimea. And Putin gave a speech where he was kind of cutesy about it and said, listen, we love our NATO friends and we love their navies. It's just we don't really want to visit them for Christmas down at Sevastopol. We would rather them come and visit us and be our friends at our base.
Right,
and
right.
so,
and real quickly, by the way, about Crimea, that was historically was part of Russia for hundreds of years, and it was Khrushchev, the Communist Party secretary, in a drunken stupor in 1954 or something.
Right.
And he was of Ukrainian origin. He said, well, I'm going to make it part of Ukraine. And that was just fiat on his part. Why did we have to defend Khrushchev's drunken fiat?
And they had stayed, really I mean, and at the time, everyone was answerable to the Kremlin only, so it didn't make any real difference anyway under the USSR. And then ever since independence, they've had all this autonomy respected and whatever. They never really were a part of Ukraine this whole time. And when you say hundreds of years, since the days of the Articles of Confederation, before George Washington and James Madison wrote our Constitution, Catherine the Great bought Crimea from the Turk, half stole it and paid reparations, bought it back in the 1780s. And then one more thing, and this is the one that Putin gets the most criticism for, is the bombing campaign in Syria. But again, this is only a reaction to America's foreign policy in Syria, which ultimately was treasonous. It was Barack Obama, John McCain, and John Brennan, who, and for that matter, Petraeus and Panetta were in on it too, who led this effort beginning in 2011 to back al-Qaeda in Iraq, the bad guys from Iraq War II, in Syria to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, which they never did succeed in doing, but they tore that country apart. And every one of those suicide bombings is on the CIA for backing and financing and training those guys and working in partnership with our allies in Israel, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, or UAE, I don't know about Bahrain, to finance these jihadists and to keep that war going for years and years and years, ultimately leading to the rise of the Islamic State that conquered all of eastern Syria and all of western Iraq and required Obama to launch Iraq War III in 2014 through 17 there that Trump finished to destroy the Islamic State that Obama himself created, essentially, by backing those guys for all of that time. Putin didn't intervene until the end of 2015, okay? 4.5 years into American CIA intervention on the side of the al-Qaeda terrorists there, when they finally were threatening Damascus, the Russians came in and started bombing them and saved the secular fascist dictatorship from the jihadist suicide bombers there. And so, again, just as George Kennan would have predicted, everyone looks at the Russian reaction to America evil doing. I mean, hey, supporting al-Qaeda. I'm paraphrasing George Bush directly. What's an evil doer if it's not somebody that backs al-Qaeda, right? I mean, that's what they were doing. Bush gave them Western Iraq accidentally because he's dumb. Obama gave them eastern Syria and as much as Syria as he could quite deliberately. He took the side of these jihadists. It's just hilarious, isn't it, to see John Brennan on TV accuse Donald Trump of treason for having a pleasant talk with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki when he is literally the leader of al-Qaeda in Syria, belongs buried under the supermax for his highest treason that makes Benedict Arnold look like George Washington? And give me a break. John Brennan, he's a free man right now. Are you kidding me? But anyway, this is what caused Russia to intervene in Syria. And that doesn't mean what Russia has done in Syria is great. The Russians have killed thousands of innocent civilians who happen to be nearby their targets. And that war is ugly as hell. But it's still a reaction to America's absolute worst behavior. And it's the first time the Russians have even found a reason or an excuse to come back to the Middle East in 25 years. They've been gone since the USSR fell apart. What are they doing back in Syria? Saving the secular state from John Brennan's suicide bomber al-Qaeda terrorists. And those are the breaks.
Right, and if Assad had been overthrown, there would have been genocide in Syria.
That's right.
By Brennan's al-Qaeda buddies.
Yeah, in fact, let me go ahead and say, I mean, the reason that there's a secular fascist dictatorship there is because there's a 70% Sunni Arab majority, super majority, and then there's a huge population also, though, in terms of numbers, not in proportion, but in terms of numbers, there are huge numbers of Assyrian, Chaldean, and Maronite Christians, Druze, and who? Oh, Armenians, Druze, and Shiite Arabs, and I'm not sure who else I'm leaving off of the list there. Some Turkmen and whoever. And it's not that 70% Sunnis were trying to kill them all or anything. They would have won if they were. In fact, I think at least a strong plurality, if not the majority of the Sunnis, were also on the side of the state with all of these other ethnic and religious minorities. It was just the small minority of the most radical Sunni jihadists backed by America who we know what would have happened because we saw what happened when they went into villages controlled by Christians. They said convert or die, and sometimes just kill them anyway. And, you know, the same thing with the Druze, where they would say, now's your chance to convert right now, or we're going to kill you. And then they would kill them because the Druze would refuse, and they would massacre them. Their slogan was Shiites to Beirut, Alawites to the grave. Right? The Alawites, they're the real ruling caste up there in alliance with the Shiites there. And so, you know, that's absolutely right, is you look at the evil of the Islamic State, such as it was in eastern Syria and western Iraq there for 4 years, 3.5 years there. Think about if they had conquered all of Syria. It's no different. Jabhat al-Nusra is the same thing as ISIS, just different leadership. It is essentially al-Qaeda. ISIS is just al-Qaeda in Iraq, broken off from al-Qaeda with a new brand name. But that's who they are, is the worst of the Sunni insurgency from Iraq War II. And imagine if they'd taken Damascus. Imagine if their border went all the way to Lebanon. What it would have taken, you know, sending in the 3rd Infantry again, like Iraq War II, to drive them back out of there. And you already look at the absolute catastrophe that was Iraq War III, just driving them out of eastern Syria and western Iraq. But if they had taken western Syria, all of western Syria too, absolute nightmare. So in the scheme of things, you know, all other things being equal, Vladimir Putin was doing the right thing, protecting that secular state from those jihadists. It doesn't excuse all the collateral damage and the rest of it, but it does say that 150% of the responsibility belongs in Washington, D.C., and 10% in Moscow.
All right. Well, Scott, again, I really appreciate it. I know we've gone way over, but of course, anybody watching
I'm happy
this,
to do it, man. I'd love to.
Yeah, you guys got a bonus here with all this information. So go to antiwar.com. It's a great resource. The Libertarian Institute. The Scott Horton Show, which you can access from either one of those other 2 places. And by the way, Scott wrote a great book, Fool's Errand, talking about the situation in Afghanistan, and he's got a project now to write another book about the terror war, and you're raising money for that. So if people go to these other resources, they can go to find that and help contribute money to help with that other project. And Scott, thank you very, very much. We look forward to chatting with you again, and thank you for being the second guest on Curmudgeonly Conversations. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Dennis. Appreciate it, bud.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.